It's Friday, and we are working for Crusoe. Sam, Park, and John Ramey with you on Friday, November 3rd, covering the week's biggest international and economic news. Today, we will look at a new U.S. jobs report. We will talk about the tentative end, of the United Auto Workers strike against the big three U.S. auto manufacturers. We have an update on the Hamas-Israel war, and possibly we will get to King Charles in Kenya if we have time. Sam Park, the jobs report has dropped. Non-farm jobs increasing by 150,000 for the month. That is lower than the forecast of 170,000. And that is a big dip from the nearly 300,000 added in September. The unemployment rate is up to 3.9, which is the highest level since January 2022. There is a manufacturing decline, and that ties in, the experts think, due to the auto strikes. So is this the soft landing that we've been talking about so much that the Fed has not been getting?
Well, it could be. The thing is, the decline in manufacturing jobs was about 35,000, and that's pretty close to the number of UAW workers that went on strike.
That will now be going back to work. That
we believe that they will be. So that's a kind of complicating factor in this month's jobs report. But even if you take those out, right, it's still only 185,000 jobs, right? That is the decline in jobs would have only been lessened by 35,000. So it does seem as though the economy is slowing down, and if that's true, then it could be the soft landing. There are still people that are predicting a recession, and there still could be one. But it does seem as though things are moderating somewhat. And I think, honestly, it seems to support the Fed's decision this week, because I thought that they might have actually raised interest rates a little bit because of the stronger data that had been coming up in previous months, but they did not do that. But then again, they see lots of data apart from this week's jobs report, obviously.
Just to recap, we had the 300,000 jobs added in September, and then we had the summer quarter, the third quarter, with the GDP rate like really high. What was it, 4.9? So we had most recently these very white-hot indicators about the economy. And so for the Fed not to raise rates, that was against expectations. But as you say, they see a lot of data, and now that kind of lines up. And I suppose that makes this holiday consumer period now maybe the point at which we really unearth some truth about the economy.
I think that's probably true. Yeah, we'll see how that data comes in. I think also, for instance, many people at the beginning of the year, as we've discussed, were predicting that we would have a recession this year. That really seems like that's off the table. That will not happen in this year. It could happen next year. But had that recession occurred, I think it really would have damaged the bargaining position of the United Auto Workers, right? If they were trying to have a strike in the teeth of significant job losses, it would have been much more difficult for them. So if I were the UAW and President Sean Fain, I might be sending a fruit basket to the folks over at the Fed who seem to have gotten the policy framework pretty much right so far, at least for the UAW, certainly right for the UAW.
Unemployment up to 3.9, which is the highest, as we mentioned, since early 2022. That's still pretty low.
Yes, it is low. And also the striking auto workers figure directly into that, right? They are people who have not left the workforce, for example, right? They're just not working, but they're going to go back to work. So again, that's not that many jobs, but it will make a difference. That is when the UAW goes back to work, which some of them have already begun to do, that will make a little bit of a difference in the unemployment rate.
Anything else on the job report, or can we pivot to the UAW resolution with the big three?
I think we should get to that because we've been talking about this a lot, and it seems like we'll be able to stop talking about it, which is kind of a mixed blessing for me. But as we know, we thought that the strike might be coming to an end last week, and it really does seem as though it's going to.
So on October 25th, the UAW had a tentative agreement with Ford. On October 28th, UAW had a tentative deal with Stellantis, the artist formerly known as Chrysler. And then on October 30th, the UAW announced a deal with General Motors. I noticed in Fain's address via his YouTube page to the membership that the message specifically about General Motors mentioned that GM had been kind of the most insidious in convoluting pay structure. And now they've got the same pay structure for all three.
Yes. I mean, as we discussed previously on Working for Crusoe, there were sort of differing demands depending upon the car maker, right? And so these deals that they've struck with the big three are sort of, we might say, harmonized. They're not identical because they haven't had identical pay structures across the big three. So they needed to sort of reconcile different sort of things that they wanted out of each car maker. But now it seems as though all three of them are broadly operating or will be broadly operating under the similar sorts of pay guidelines.
Now, the union membership still has to ratify these.
That's right. Ford began voting yesterday, and I haven't seen any final results. I saw preliminary results from one plant, and the tentative agreement with Ford passed by something like 81% in favor. So, I think once the Ford agreement was announced, everybody pretty much figured that things would just line up and everybody would fall in line. And they all did. I mean, tentative agreements, as you mentioned, just came within days of one another after that first agreement. The night of October 25th, when the Ford agreement was announced, John, as I've mentioned to you in some of our private conversations, one of the things I've been doing throughout the strike is looking at YouTube clips from local television stations in Detroit. And the night of the 25th, literally right after the Ford agreement was announced, which was the breakthrough agreement that
it was the first domino.
Yeah, exactly. WXYZ TV in Detroit, which incidentally is now my favorite television station name in all of America.
Also a longtime radio station in Detroit.
I'm sure it is.
Yeah.
One reason that it is my favorite, by the way, which it took me a couple of days to put together, is that XYZ is an affiliate of ABC.
Oh, there you go.
You see what they did there, John?
Very 20th century, Sam.
Yeah. Anyway, XYZ had an interview with some nameless Ford worker coming off the picket line, right? It's dark, right? It's the end of the day when the agreement was announced. And this fella, who, again, they didn't tell you what his name was. He was, a beefy, middle-aged white guy from Detroit. And he's coming off the picket line in the dark. And he's holding back tears, unsuccessfully, I might add, right? But the first thing he said was, it's just such a relief to be getting back to work. But then he went on to say that he was very proud of what the union had been able to accomplish. And I've seen numerous such interviews ever since, when all of the tentative agreements have been announced. And that's, pretty much the general agreement. Literally everybody said, I'm relieved to be going back to work. But almost everybody said also that they were very proud of what the union had been able to accomplish. And they should be. Right? This was an historic agreement. I remember a couple of weeks ago when President Fain seemed to be giving sort of a pep talk to the membership and saying, this was right before the Ford agreement, mind you, saying, we've already made historic gains, but there is more that we can do. So let's hold the line. And he was right. They got more out of all of the big three after that than they had gotten already, which was, again, already historic concessions from the big three. So they should all be very proud of what they've done.
Now, we like to distinguish ourselves from a lot of other media outlets in that we don't like to make grand sweeping predictions and proclamations. So I will resist my institutional media instinct to declare or at least explore this as a watershed moment in the history of American organized labor. But I do think we can say without a doubt that it is an apex, a high watermark of organized labor in the United States in the 21st century. And it had been growing for some time, as we discussed on previous episodes prior to the pandemic.
Yes. Well, but we'll have to see how that works out. For example, as we've discussed, one of the crucial elements of this strike was striking all of the big three at the same time, which the UAW had never previously done. And I think just structurally, that was an enormous innovation and one of the crucial elements that made this, that earned the UAW these concessions from the big three. But for example, the actors here in Hollywood are still on strike.
Even though the writers have gone back to work.
That's right. But they're negotiating against the Association of Motion Picture and Television Producers. That is an umbrella group that negotiates on behalf of all of the film and television studios collectively.
Right. And so do the writers. It's not as though Writers Guild and SAG-AFTRA are banging out a deal with Netflix and
Disney,
Paramount and Disney or whomever.
That's right. So if the big three had such an umbrella group, the UAW would not have been able to pursue this divide and conquer tactic, which again worked out fabulously for them. They were able to play all the big three off against one another. As soon as the Ford deal was announced, basically everybody knew this is what, listen, GM and Stellantis, this is what you have to do. Come to where Ford is and we can end this, right? But the actors aren't going to be able to do that. On the other hand, this week it was announced that pharmacists from, I believe, CVS and Walgreens and also Rite Aid, which doesn't really matter because they're filing for bankruptcy, but the pharmacists at all three of these companies are going to be going on strike, or at least considering doing so. As far as I know, the pharmacy companies don't have an umbrella group that's going to be negotiating on behalf of all of them at the same time. So they might be able to employ the same kind of divide and conquer tactics that the UAW did. We'll see.
Finally on this, for me, the big kind of takeaways. One, the elimination of the two-tiered wage system at all three big automakers. That was
it's not quite an elimination, right? They've reduced the distance between the tiers, right? For instance, if you get hired as a temp, you get promoted to full-time much more quickly than you used to, right? But it's not like nobody's getting hired as a temp anymore, right? So there still will be tiers. It won't be, as Ozzy Osbourne memorably said, no more tears.
Okay, so the near elimination of the tier system. But the larger takeaway for me is that Chrysler is owned by something called Stellantis. I think that's what I will carry with me. That's just
really
so
that's your takeaway, John?
Well, apart from the previously mentioned apex of American labor in the 21st century.
Okay, well, let me tell you what my two takeaways are.
Please.
All right. First of all, there was some worry that success on behalf of the unions would delay the transition to the electric vehicle market from internal combustion engines. And in fact, Ford announced right after the tentative agreement was announced that they were in fact going to delay their investments in the transition to electric vehicles. They were very careful not to assign this delay to the success of the strike. Instead, they attributed it to a real and very recent collapse in electric vehicle demand across the United States. For instance, Tesla has been saying the same thing. So Ford's not making that up, right? That's a real thing. On the other hand, Stellantis and GM this week said that they were in fact still going to pursue their transition plans towards electric vehicles, leaving Ford kind of going wah wah wah, right? And so these worries, they're still real, I think, but they're not quite as pronounced as we might have thought they would be. I saw a number of interviews, actually, both on television and in print, with a business school professor at Wayne State University. His name was Merrick Masters. And he said that he thought the Ford agreement in particular would lead to an increase in average vehicle retail price of about $900. Now, that's not nothing, but it's about 2% of the average sticker price of an American vehicle. And so, I mean, it seems to me that that's like, what, 1 or 2 car payments? Again, that's not inconsiderable, right? That's something you want to factor in when you're making your decisions about a new car purchase. But it's not that big a bump.
I believe I'd heard at some point in the strike that labor cost is only like 5% of the cost of an automobile.
That's right. And so, so far, this seems to have worked out pretty well for everybody. The other thing I want to talk about, though, is that, for instance, last night, President Fain and one of his vice presidents made their video announcement about the Stellantis tentative agreement. And the reason for this was to reveal the final language of the agreement, which had been announced days earlier. So they needed some time to write everything up and get everything squared away and present that language to the Stellantis UAW membership so that they could see it. They went through some of the highlights, but all the Stellantis union members will be able to look at all the language before they vote early next week. However, Chairman Fain devoted the first couple of minutes of his 15-minute address to Toyota, a non-union foreign manufacturer who does manufacture vehicles in the United States. Toyota announced, I believe it was Tuesday night of this week, that, what do you know? We're just going to pay all of our American employees 9% more.
What do you know?
Yeah. And so
Toyota manufactures in Kentucky, I believe.
That's right. In fact, well, I'll get to that. But first of all, I thought that the UAW played this exactly right. They could have come out with a message immediately in response to the Toyota announcement, but they didn't. Again, the proximate reason for last night's address was the Stellantis tentative agreement. Here's what you get, so you can vote on it. But I think it was wise to begin the address with the talking about Toyota, right? And basically saying, hey, great Toyota workers that you got a raise. You're welcome, right? But Fain explicitly said, you could have gotten more if you were with us. And I actually saw an interview the other day on the Associated Press with a fellow named Tim Smith, who's the UAW executive in charge of Region 8 in Kentucky, as you mentioned, right? That's where the Kentucky Ford truck plant is. That was the last UAW facility struck against Ford before Ford came to the table with the tentative agreement that busted the dam open. And Toyota has a plant, as you say, in Georgetown, Kentucky, not that far away. Tim Smith of Region 8 said, oh, we're getting lots of calls from Toyota workers. Now, I don't know how many calls he's actually getting. He has to say he's getting calls, but I imagine he's probably getting some. And the UAW now has 5 years to try and unionize Toyota and other non-union automakers in the United States, including Tesla. We'll see how they do. Again, if there had been a recession this year, this would not have worked out. And we don't know what the macroeconomic conditions of the United States are going to look like in 5 years. Maybe they'll be able to unionize some plants here or there, or some auto manufacturers here and there, but they can't be all that confident of what their negotiating position is going to look like the next time they have to come to the table. They just simply can't know. I wish them all the luck in the world, but it's a big question mark. But the final thing I would just like to say about this is that I'm going to miss Sean Fain, right? He's been a very entertaining figure to me. And I think it was only this week that I was able to put this together. We've sort of hinted at it, but he inhabits two different categories in our country that are sort of assumed to be at odds with one another, right? He is a member of the white working class, right? Very definitively. If you just watch him and listen to him talk.
He's about the most white working class guy you can imagine.
Yes, but he's also a member of what our former president continues to call the radical left. And he makes no bones about that either. He's pretty far. He's always talking about corporate greed, the billionaire class. He compared them to the Nazis.
I was just going to say, right? Yes, I recall that.
He did a video wearing the T-shirt that said, "Eat the rich." I mean, it's no joke. And
are you saying he's AOC in Donald Trump clothing?
I don't know. I mean, but unlike AOC,
or Trump voter clothing.
He's a white man. Yeah, he's a white schlubby guy from Indiana, right? But in his presentation, he doesn't seem to think there should be any contradiction between those two categories.
And that's why you and I have both found him so compelling.
Yeah. And now the good news is that I'm pretty confident that we're going to see him campaigning for President Biden sometime next year, certainly in Michigan, but perhaps in any other swing state that hosts a UAW facility. So this is not the last we've seen of Sean Fain. It's just that we won't get to see him every week like we have been.
The latest in Gaza. The Israeli military has encircled Gaza City. This is the start of an invasion. All of this in response to the October 7th attacks by Hamas. More than 1,400 Israelis have been killed in this Hamas-Israel war. Israeli airstrikes and artillery and various mini incursions prior to this latest encirclement have led to the death of over 9,000 Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Antony Blinken, the United States Secretary of State, has gone to meet with Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel and has more or less said, you guys, you Israel, need to be careful about the brutality of your campaign or you're going to lose international support. Blinken and the Biden administration and many other voices in the international community have called for humanitarian pauses in the attacks on Gaza to allow for humanitarian aid, to allow for civilian evacuation. The Israelis say no unless there are negotiations about the still remaining hostages in Gaza. People are starting to talk about the military campaign as an incomplete reaction or solution, thinking about things like a power vacuum, if in fact Israel is to successfully wipe out Hamas in Gaza, a proposition that seems not necessarily destined to succeed. But even if it does, what comes next? Sam, there was also the leader of Hezbollah making a televised address for the first time since October 7th.
Yes, Hassan Nasrallah.
And he said everything up to we're joining this war.
That's right.
But he did say Hezbollah is going to continue to harass Israel from the southern border of Lebanon, the northern border of Israel. And he also said the 2 U.S. aircraft carriers do not scare Hezbollah. The United States Navy had put 2 carrier groups off the Levant in the Mediterranean Sea.
I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, Sam, sorry, there's just so much. I'm just trying to kind of present to you what I feel are the most kind of relevant recent developments.
Yes, well, I think it's difficult to keep track of, but have been many trucks of humanitarian aid that have gone in to Gaza since our last show. So I think it behooves us to point that out.
Right.
It's nowhere near enough. Everybody agrees. No one thinks it's anywhere near enough. But to go back to Nasrallah, he also said that the attacks of October 7th were, in his words, 100% Palestinian, which I found very interesting, right? You're saying, look, it wasn't us. Okay. He did, he expressed solidarity.
It's interesting he would go out of his way to say that.
Yes, right. That if they're 100% not Palestinian, then they're 0% Lebanese, right? And Nasrallah and Hezbollah are Lebanese. They are not Palestinian. And so he, as you say, he went right up to the edge of saying that they were going to join the war, but he didn't say that they were. I think that was what people were scared of, right? I mean, there's some exchange of fire in between northern Israel and Lebanon on a good week, right? I mean, even before October 7th. So, and yes, it has escalated since October 7th, but there so far does not seem to be any indication of a full-on second front opening up. Now, that could still happen, right? I think we mentioned last week, I believe that Hezbollah will keep careful track of how the Israeli incursion into Gaza is going. And if it seems as though Israel is getting bogged down in some sort of quagmire in Gaza, then perhaps Hezbollah will get involved. But I don't think we should assume that they're going to. Both Hezbollah and their patron, Iran, have a balance of issues that they have to work to make that decision. I mean, it would just be stupid of them to make that decision now from a tactical point of view, let alone anything else. And that, honestly, the tactical point of view is the only thing that I feel remotely qualified to make a judgment about.
Is Blinken right that the brutality of the Israeli response, and again, it's ghastly to do this, but when you're looking at under or fewer than 1,500 dead Israelis, and you're looking at now 9,000 thereabouts.
Oh, of course he's right.
Palestinians. I mean, there is a body count issue that I do notice was very absent when the United States attacked countries after 9/11.
Yes, and I think that's honestly, for once, I want to give a lot of credit to the global and even the American news media, which, especially in the United States, is still generally very pro-Israel, but it's more balanced than it's ever been before that I've seen. I've never seen anywhere near as much reporting from inside Gaza than I have in the past month. And the day after the attacks, literally on October 8th, on Meet the Press, the granddaddy of American political analysis TV shows, Andrea Mitchell, the senior foreign affairs correspondent for NBC News, and as far as I can tell, the senior correspondent of NBC News as an entity, was one of the panelists. And she said, Israeli settlement activity in the West Bank is proceeding at a record pace and has been for a long time. She went there immediately. And so, again, this is a very difficult issue to report on. For example, for a very long time, people who have said, for years, Hamas uses Palestinian civilians as human shields. And that is true.
And that has never been more true than right now.
That's right. Hamas is a terrorist organization, and that's one thing that terrorists do. But in the past, that's always been sort of a conversation ender as a rhetorical tactic. Hamas uses civilians as human shields, therefore X, Y, and Z, right? Partly because of video technology and communications technology it's sort of seemed to dawn on global news media, well, if the shields are human, then we can interview them. And they have been doing that, right? And that's this, no one ever thought of this or had necessarily the technological capability of doing so before. But I've seen, and I'm sure you have too, many interviews over landlines or, terrible cell phone signals from inside Gaza this past couple of weeks, where you interview the human shield. And what do you think they're going to say? Please don't shoot me, right? What do you expect, right? And so this actually advances the conversation, where instead of saying, oh, well, they're human shields and that's the end of it, right? It's like,
right.
Well,
we now hear from the human shield.
Yeah, what do the shields say, right? And I think, as awful as this situation is, it's at least an improvement that we can do this. We can actually advance this conversation. But on a broader view, when October 7th happened, the atrocities of those attacks, and take the names out, doesn't matter what nationality these people are. The natural reaction of anybody is to sympathize with the victims. Today, when bombs are being dropped on Gaza every day,
including a refugee camp twice.
What a hospital, a refugee camp, yeah. Every place in Gaza, right? Of course, if you see these people getting bombed out of their homes, again, take the names out, take the nationalities out.
There's a natural empathy.
That's so. Yeah, if you're the one dropping the bombs, yeah, you're going to lose public sympathy. I think, again, doesn't matter if you're Israel, it doesn't matter if you're Switzerland, right? If you're the one doing it, you're going to lose public support, and nobody should be surprised about this.
It was brought up on Ezra Klein's most recent podcast that a lot of the countries who are calling on Israel to prioritize humanitarian considerations in their response to these terrorist attacks, a lot of these countries fought their wars for existence before there were things like the UN, right? Nobody was talking about pausing the bombings of Japan and Nazi Germany for humanitarian aid when the Allies were trying to save the world, right? It's just, I do think that needs to be pointed out. Every single country that's saying, okay, hold on, play by the rules. When it was the United States, when it was the Allies defending the worst attacks in human history.
Yeah, bombing Dresden.
Right.
But we do have a UN now.
Sure.
Okay. And should we just pretend we don't?
I'm not suggesting that. I'm just saying the rules are different. And a lot of the people who are enforcing the rules didn't have to play by them.
They are. And the standards are different also. But one thing I would point out is that, for example, there is a genocide happening in the western region of Sudan right now, Muslim on Muslim, and nobody's really talking about this. This week, Pakistan is deporting tens of thousands of Afghans into the tender mercies of the Taliban next door. I don't hear the Saudi government declaiming against this. But to return to Secretary Blinken, which I think is the most relevant factor here, he's right. And he's also, I think, adopting the right technique of saying that on a strategic level, right, you need to be careful about this because this is not just a military issue. This is a global political issue, and you need to be very careful about how you execute this.
And if anybody is qualified to give that advice in the 21st century, it is the United States.
I think that's right. And so this is, an issue and a story that we're sadly going to have to keep returning to in future weeks. But there's so many different interests that are being balanced here every minute. Like with Hassan Nasrallah and his speech, so careful in what he said and did not say, right? And everybody's, for instance, I haven't heard a word out of Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in a month, who seemed to want to be considered to be a major player on the world stage up until October 7th. Now he's MIA. So how did that work out for you, MBS? Maybe he'll surface again and have something to say about this or about Pakistan or about Sudan. I'm not going to be holding my breath.
Okay, for next week, I know we promised it this week, but next week we should talk about the political realities in Israel that preceded October 7th with the this current Netanyahu government, and what it means now for the future state of Israel.
Yes, I think that's a very important discussion that we do need to have.
Questions, comments, suggestions, johnrameymedia@gmail.com. Thanks to all of you who are listening on YouTube and, of course, on the Substack and on Apple and all the other platforms. So appreciate all you listening. He's Sam Park. I'm John Ramey. Have yourselves a great weekend.
Thanks, everybody.